The Open Therapy Institute is addressing bias in mental health care. Go to our website, opentherapyinstitute.org. We have CE credit workshops about overlooked issues in the field. You can go to our workshop page and register now and become a member. And for those looking for a therapist, we match people with someone who's highly skilled and truly open. Just contact us through the contact page on the website or email us at info@opentherapyinstitute.org. Hello, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce of the Radical Center.
And I'm Andrew Hartz of the Open Therapy Institute.
Andrew, I think this is maybe our 7th conversation that we're recording for this podcast series, and I'm really interested in the topic that you raised for today, which is the development and impact of racial schemas.
Yeah, thanks. I think the idea for this topic came when maybe it was like 5 or 6 years ago, maybe it was even 10 years ago, when I started to see society really emphasizing racial differences more and more, both explicitly, verbally, that there was a discussion of race that was being introduced into school pedagogies and into the media, and other aspects of culture, even like entertainment and art museums. And it was just kind of like spreading through movies and ads, and but also like non-verbally, where I started to notice like changes in subway ads, where there'd be ads that would have, you know, there weren't white people in ads, like, or it was like all Black people, or every group was represented in a particular way.
Mhm.
And I started just to kind of like be, I could see that this project that was being launched in our society, who knows where it came from, but it seemed to be happening in a kind of orchestrated way. I'm not sure if it was or not, but it felt that way. Um, and I could see it affecting me. Whereas before, I might see ads and I didn't even, somebody's like, "Oh, did you see there was only one Black person in that ad, or there was only two women, or there was only one man," or something." I'd be like, I didn't notice that. I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about the clothes they were wearing or something else about the ad.
Mhm.
And then now I was starting to see, no, it's actually like sinking into my psyche,
Mhm.
and I could actually see it starting to affect me, where I'm noticing it first. And I'm saying, why did they cast that person in this role? And why did they do this here? And it seemed like all of the media was trying to make racial differences more salient and kind of push people towards racial identifications. One way that this happened too in my training was like with the concept of white privilege, because you can't accept your white privilege without making a racial identification as a white person. So you have to identify as white and really kind of solidify a racial identity in order to see the white privilege. And so, and I think there's some kind of contradictions in the literature, because they'll say you shouldn't make racial identifications, and then they kind of force you into racial identifications. But I was kind of like, one reason why I was resistant to accepting white privilege. I think there were a number of them, but one of them was that I didn't want to make that racial identification. And
Mhm.
I think, looking back at my life, I think if you had asked me when I was 10 or 20 or 30 even, like, how do I identify? How do I identify? I don't know that race would have been on there. I kind of think it probably wouldn't have been mentioned. It would have been like, well, I like alternative music and I, live in New York or something. Like, it would have been a totally different constellation of things. And I don't know that being male, being white, these types of things, I don't know that they would have been on there. And so there's this prioritizing of these specific categories. And I think what I was noticing related to this for me was like, once this, it was almost like it was being injected into my bloodstream,
Mm-hmm.
and I could almost like feel it in my body and feel it affecting my senses, like how I would see and hear things. And even though I did feel like was trying to resist it, like almost kind of being overpowered by it and not really struggling to find a way to not be subsumed in it, but ultimately kind of like really being overpowered by it, even at an unconscious level where I'm noticing and looking at things, counting the races, because that's what the people making the ads and making the movies are doing. They're counting the races. And there's something where then the audience gets that and they're
Mm-hmm.
counting the races.
Mm-hmm.
And and I was thinking, like, as this was being, like, for me, kind of against my will, I think, forced into my psyche through this program, um, all these other dilemmas started to emerge about how I see myself, um, how I see my connection to my ancestors, my culture, history, other people,
Mm-hmm.
and starting to think about other people as like, um, especially because there's so much racial aggression that often went with it, where, white people were often, it was often used as a slur.
Mm-hmm.
People would say white people, and they obviously meant it as an insult and with real venom. And and so there's this defensive reaction to be like, no, I'm not the awful person that you're speaking to me as if I am. But it just set up these challenges of like, do I want to see myself this way? How do I not see myself as this way? It's almost like to defend against all the attacks. That also entrenches this identity that I didn't want to make in the first place. And so I think it set up a bunch of challenges and dilemmas in terms of how I saw myself and what I felt and how I interacted with the world that were really new to me. And I think, and I didn't know how to make heads or tails of it at first. And I saw it in people, friends of mine of all races and backgrounds, where people would ask about, and some of this had to do probably with ancestry.com and like 23andMe and stuff, but all of a sudden, what's your ancestry became a question that people were interested in. And I just don't think as a kid I ever heard that. And and I remember with a friend who I love a lot, a really good friend. We went to a church, a beautiful cathedral, and we walked through this space. And when we get out, he commented on the fact that like Jesus was this blue-eyed, blonde-haired person in one of the paintings. And it's just like, how do you go into this huge cathedral and you can be thinking about truth and love and architecture and beauty and history and light or whatever you're going to think about the human condition. And that's where everybody's eyes go, is to this racial problematization of the depiction of Jesus. And it could be like, most places they painted Jesus like the people who were around them at the time. And that kind of more or less became an idiom. And maybe it should change now, but it doesn't surprise me that people did it that way for thousands of years. And I'm not sure it's such an awful thing. And now it's like I have to argue with my friend about that. Um, but it's like, instead of any of the other things about faith and the Bible and morality and like, or whatever it could be that we could think about. And I saw this when I taught at college level and graduate level courses too, where we could have this like beautiful reading. And if there was a racial or gender piece to fixate on, that's where the students' minds went. They'd been trained to focus on that. So other things, again, like about the psyche, about emotion, about truth, about what it means to be human or meaning, or all that got pushed aside. And let's actually argue about race instead. And they're just so demoralizing. And the more you do it, the more it gets entrenched.
Mm-hmm.
And I would see this in let you talk in a second. I would see this in textbooks too.
Hmm.
Like the textbooks changed, and it wasn't an outline of the most influential people. It was like, oh, we've inserted this person who didn't do very much, but is a woman or is
Hmm.
black or is Asian, and you've never heard of them, and their work actually didn't have a huge impact, and it's maybe not even that interesting, but they're now in the textbook. And so what the textbook has a limited, like there is a size limit. The textbook can't be, you know, more than people can read in a semester. Like it has a limit. And so we'll just cut out Freud's theory about dreams because we don't have space for it. And it made all the textbooks like more boring and worse because it's like half of the textbook is this stuff. And and it just, there's something there's this, Allen Ginsberg had this really great essay about what he called his religious experience when he was reading William Blake.
Hmm.
And he said that his thought was that William Blake had like encoded secret psychic messages into his poetry that Allen Ginsberg was, centuries later unlocking and having these subtle sensory or spiritual revelations that were being communicated that were like encoded in the text. And he talked about something similar with like looking at the paintings of Cezanne,
Hmm.
that Cezanne had like encoded these experiences in the painting that were then being like psychically communicated across time to the viewer. And there is something, it's a that really literally is what art does, though. It
Hmm.
really is this kind of psychic, weird communication where you get experiences and feelings and insights that aren't quite rational. And you feel something or see something that you can't explain. There's this kind of psychic communication happening between the creator and the viewer. And it's not, you can't always pin down like, this is why I felt this. This is why it's like, no, it was somehow subtly encoded within the letters or something.
Hmm.
And and I can tell when I watch a movie or when I see ads or when I go to, it's some of it's pretty obvious, like not to, some of it's very explicit. But even when it's not, the psychic state of the preoccupation with a couple of demographic categories is so viscerally communicated.
Hmm.
And even if you're kind of like, you know, they can play dumb and kind of be like, what? You just think shouldn't be a black man who's in this role, or you just think this or whatever. It's like, I know what's happening. I
Hmm.
can feel it, I see it. And it's like, and you can see the preoccupation with these categories, the resentments, the anger, the desire to hurt and humiliate certain people, the grandiosity and arrogance in other demographic categories. You feel it. And it's kind of like, I think it's just being encoded in the way these arts are being made now. But the important thing, thinking about us psychologically, it's not just about the art, it's changing people psychologically,
Hmm.
and it's creating all these new dilemmas and conflicts and challenges for people adapting to, I think, a different culture that is totally different from 20 years ago when we were trying to judge people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And this is a totally different model. And as it sinks in, and I think it is sinking in, it's posing all kinds of new problems that a lot of us, like myself, hoped we never had to deal with, and now we do. So that was the impetus for wanting to talk about the racial schema. But I'll stop. I'm curious what you're thinking.
Well, I'm thinking so many things. That's really, uh, I really love your insights around the art and what the subtexts are. And it's, I don't know if subtext is even the right word. It's almost like this drama that is replacing a lot of the dramas that we would have been um, experiencing or listening to it, like take a movie, that if this is the overlay, the central plot kind of becomes background for this drama that's playing out on a larger cultural field. And yet it's almost a passive aggressive drama because, like you say, there's this plausible deniability with that. Like if you notice that drama and if you talk about it in any way that's not completely supportive and glossy, then
Right.
you can be called out for even noticing that. But it's a drama that's taking center stage in front of the substance of the entertainment, what it would have been. And when you're talking about your own experience, kind of starting to notice these ads and how it kind of gets into you start to do that inventorying yourself,
Right.
and the viewer starts to do that. We start to notice that there's a, it's really interesting how we take that up and make it a part of our own process, even if we're reluctant to do it. And I think I had a different sort of, I don't want to use the words racial identity development model because that's
Right.
the way that we're
Right.
taught to talk about that. But I think
Right.
my experience of it was really different because I was a Caucasian person in an area that was largely Hispanic. I was one of the minority for being a white person when I was growing up, when I was a kid. And so I was really aware of it from a very early age. It was not something that I ever had ignorance around. Being white was something I'm like, my earliest kindergarten experiences were being made fun of for being white. And I can remember walking home and having boys yelling at me all the way home as a kindergartner, a honky cracker, these kind of words. And so this was a
Right.
really, and
Right.
I remember thinking like childish responses to them. Well, I'm not a cracker because a cracker is, whatever it was,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
words rolling around in my mind. But it was
Right.
one of my earliest social experiences, and it was a constant social experience for me, was the sense that I was white and that white was undesirable.
Right.
And it took me a long time to come to terms with that as a young adult, and kind of reprocess all the bullying that I had experienced and see it in a larger on a larger social scale, and realize that all these racial dynamics are really complicated. And I sort of had this sense that, as someone who had experienced being a racial underdog, I had more empathy for other people who had that same experience, and that most of the people that we will meet in the United States who have that experience aren't white. And so I had this
Right.
sense of greater empathy towards the experience of being left out, or being
Right.
treated as if you are less desirable, or kind of a marginalized, as they like to say. And then the culture started to creep in with more and more of this heavy-handed entertainment and advertising push to flatten out our ideas of racial identity. And I I I thought it was I think I responded pretty defensively to that at first. Like, I spent my whole childhood going through that. I'm not going back there now, was
Mm.
kind of my own response to that. But if I can recall the first couple of times I maybe saw that kind of thing, it would have been like, do you remember the United Colors of Benetton? Do you remember that at all? I think
They
it
were like
was
a
makeup
clothing.
or clothing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know. I mean, I know. I'm vaguely familiar with the brand,
Yeah,
but
same.
yeah.
I mean, I only remember because I was a young girl and I looked at a lot of magazines. And so I saw a lot of
Okay.
magazine ads. And so this is one of the first places I really saw that sort of push to make you aware of color and inclusion. And so they would have these ads that were really beautiful with women with, I guess, clothing or makeup, but they'd all be really pretty young women, but of every different shade. So you'd have the girl from the very darkest skin tone all the way to the very lightest
Mm.
represented in these ads. And
Right.
this was when I first kind of became aware this was being done because there were people who didn't feel like they were seeing themselves represented in advertising.
Uh-huh.
And so for women and for fashion and beauty advertising, this was a big deal. And so
Right.
it seemed benevolent. It seemed nice. It sort of started this way, I thought, or at least in my cultural awareness. And then it became more almost this forced by committee, we have to do this everywhere. And that leads up to what you were saying about art. And I love William Blake too, but I have never read that article, that paper, but I'd like to read that. That's really interesting. Um, I think that and I read a ton as a kid. I read voraciously, and every one of the thoughts that I felt that I had when I would read is, this is the closest you can ever really get to knowing another person's mind. When you get into their art and their words, you can almost know what it's like to be another person a little bit. You're with them on this really intimate mental psychological journey in this very, very special way. And what you're talking about with these narratives or these elements coming in so strong in our art and entertainment and our culture, it really does supplant the substance of the art in a very important way that I don't think I've heard anybody talk about.
Totally. It is interesting like how yeah, there's like I think they're doing it. I think they're doing it wrong.
Mm.
Basically. And it's like I know like for example, like if you were to have a show of like a crime fighting group of like I don't know, to be the modern Power Rangers or something like that. Um like if you have a group of that your show's about a group of people, it's like there is this kind of need that like okay, well like the gender split needs to be about 50-50. You've got to have one, probably two black people. One person's probably got to have a disability or something. Like you need an Asian or Latino. I think it could go either way. Either one. It's like there's just this whole like it's like there's a Hays code of
Mhm.
how this has to be presented.
Mhm.
And it's like, as opposed to, if you think about a show like Seinfeld, where it's like,
Mhm.
okay, Jerry's like a neat freak and he's really picky, and like Kramer's wacky but lovable, and George is like the angry loser or whatever. There's this like they're defined by their personalities.
Mhm.
And even though you could have the ratio that you want and still say they're still defined by they still have all those personalities, but you can kind of see um, the demographics
Mhm.
mattering more. Like one of them has to be LGBT for sure.
Mhm.
It's just kind of like there's a certain set, and it ends up being this kind of like artificial, curated thing that accentuates the differences rather than diminishing them.
Mhm.
And it also, I think it accentuates barriers between people, like that when if these differences are all really important, that means there's barriers between people. These are like, there is a difference. Like, and that's something else that like activists will say explicitly, like that empathy is impossible beyond across racial boundaries. Like you can't understand the
Mhm.
experience of somebody in another race. Or maybe that's only white people can't understand other races, but other races can understand white people, or it's usually something like that. But it's there's a if people soak that in, it does like it sinks in to the unconscious. And there is this sense of like they can't understand me and I can't understand them. And it's actually like separating people more. And I think it's not something that's like it's something that's like, I mean, you mentioned in another one of these podcasts, like somebody in your program who was, I think, black and dating a white guy, or maybe married to a white guy, and was like questioning the
Mhm.
relationship based on the education. And it's like, yeah, there are couples that are deciding that they can't understand each other because
Mhm.
these differences are sinking in psychologically in a way that can even impact their sexuality, their emotions, like all these things have a different meaning. Like, and I do think like interracial relationships do have a different meaning if the race matters a lot.
Hmm.
There's a different meaning now than if it doesn't matter and you're just two people and you're in love and what's it matter? Like you can still have a shared life together or whatever.
Hmm.
But if it's like, no, 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 you're both highly racially identified people then it's like, so I think that just, you get the sense of all these meanings and feelings and identifications and interpersonal dynamics that start to emerge as the racial schema and the racial identifications really start to soak in and get entrenched for people. And I think a lot of people are just kind of like, they don't have a vocabulary for it.
Hmm.
And they're totally overwhelmed by it, and they haven't had like an immune system to fight it off. They don't
Hmm.
really know how to metabolize it. And I think they're just at sea. Like and they're experiencing all this stuff, but they don't know how to talk about it. And then it's so sad because it's like then they're like gonna end their marriage or
Hmm.
something
Hmm.
because of these feelings that they're bombarded with.
You used a phrase there, Hayes Code. I really like that phrase. It's the
Uh,
Hayes is the developer of the addressing model, and the idea of like this demographic category separation that indicates privilege
oh,
and
oh, I didn't know that.
marginalization. Hayes Code.
Uh,
I've never heard that
No, no, no.
before.
Well, oh, the
Hayes.
Hays Code was a classic Hollywood
Okay.
code that they used to have. I should have
Oh,
explained this.
okay.
Yeah, so in classic Hollywood, before they had movie ratings, they had something
Okay.
called the Hays Code, and there were certain things
Oh,
that you couldn't have in old movies. Like
okay.
you couldn't represent clergy in a bad light. You couldn't show people getting away with a crime.
Mm,
There were certain things that you couldn't do, like and so all of the Hollywood studios, this would have been, I don't, when did the Hays Code? The Hays Code might have gone out even in the 40s.
okay.
But it was like, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it basically, they all signed on to like not make movie. And it was a way to keep
Mm,
government regulation out of movies, was they
okay.
said, we'll all sign on to do this. So if you watch an old movie, the original Ocean's 11 with Frank
Hmm.
Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., and they do uh, this bank heist. I hope this isn't spoiler alert. They do this bank heist, but you know from the beginning that they're not going to get away with it because they cannot show somebody getting away with a crime. And
Mm,
so actually every movie made before that code went out of effect, you couldn't show anyone ever getting away with a crime.
mm,
And so they're just things like that. But now there's this, that's what I meant. There's this new set of rules. You
hmm.
cannot make movies without certain emphasis on certain demographic features.
That's really interesting because you could almost use the same phrase
Yes,
and mean,
exactly.
yeah, yeah. That's so,
Yeah,
it's interesting that it was intended to keep, I guess, the creative art process virtuous by society's standards of virtue. And
I
so
think,
this would be a similar sort of thing. I mean, you could almost call it a Hays Code for diversity. But
yes.
that's really interesting. When you were talking about how in your you said in your 20s, 30s, etc., if you had been asked about your identity, race wouldn't have even popped into your mind. And I think the same thing. If I'm asked about my identity now, I'm not going to think about race because that's not my
Hmm.
identity to myself. That's not a necessary. And I would hope that that would be the same for just about anybody. If we're talking about your identity, if I were
Hmm.
black, I wouldn't, why would I think the first thing about myself being black? That's sort of your social, that's your profile. I mean, if I'm thinking about
Um,
my social profile to another person, then maybe I would have to start thinking about myself in terms of those kinds of category differences. But if I think about my identity, I'm going to think first about things that I do, or things that are important to me, or things that I've developed, like I'm a mother and I am I listen to people, whatever it is that I think
right,
of
right.
myself as doing. But this race first project And it is the thing that, this was one of the first things that I balked at when I was studying counseling, when I was a counseling student, was that we were told that as counselors, our job was to increase our clients' racial identity salience. No matter what they came in for, this was an
Hmm.
important thing that we were supposed to do, was to
Wow.
help them increase their racial identity salience. We were actually told to broach race as a topic in the first session with every single client, which is
Right.
that same overlay. It's that same thing as we're doing with entertainment and with advertising. It's the putting race in front. And it feels very contrived. It doesn't feel like this, that we didn't have a conversation about this in counselor education, about what this is going to, how does this help the individual? But instead we're having
Right.
conversations about how this would help people socially. How does this help minorities and the marginalized? And so you're using this as a tool to create a social change, but there's no conversation about what is happening on the individual level. Does the individual become happier and more well-adjusted and have better
Right.
relationships with other people? And I think the things that you're pointing to when you're talking about how it can impact couples, for instance, that's just one really important facet. But I can't really see how this helps individuals in any way.
Well, yeah, and I think it does, it's about creating these ruptures between people, these
Hmm.
gaps,
Hmm.
these perceived gaps that empathy can't cross, or maybe deep personal connection can't cross.
Hmm.
These kind of like fissures. And I think those are, I do think they're psychologically experienced as wounds. It's
Hmm.
like and maybe and as confinements. There's such a limitation in what you can do that I think fosters frustration and isolation. And um, I think another thing too, and then I want to go back to what you're saying about identity, because I think that was really interesting. But another dilemma here too. I mean, I think pressuring patients to make racial identification should be said, not an evidence-based practice.
Hmm.
And I think there are lots of reasons to suspect that it's actually harmful and actively countertherapeutic.
Hmm.
It's interesting how much of these interventions aren't even researched. They don't even like
Hmm.
they're not even trying to get the
Hmm.
research on this. They just are forcing people into it and making assumptions. But I think another thing too that happens when people make the racial identification, and again, either willfully or not, um, is they get into a battle with stereotype, with the cultural stereotype. Do you own it and hype, yeah, I am this, and that's good, and I like it, or do you reject it and you're kind of like, I share the negative view of it and I'm above that, or I'm critical of it, but you're in a battle now
Hmm.
with that stereotype on one side or the other. And I think it leads to, like, that can be a source of conflict too. Internal conflict, or conflict with others. The thing about identity that is really interesting, and I think I don't like the word identity because I think it's a very confusing word. Most of the time, I think the way it's used, it means self-image.
Hmm.
And so it's, what's your self-image is identity. But that's, a self-image is not who you are.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, and I think the idea that who we are is something that's like um unnameable and subjective. It's the one who sees and hears and acts, and it's not, it's totally different from how you look in a photograph.
Hmm.
Um and I think though that even like, but I think the demographic boxes, they have to be the most crude and external and superficial aspects of even the the self-image.
Hmm.
Because like, even a really nuanced self-image, like, I like, my name's Andrew and I like to, eat Italian food or something. It's like, there's not like, it's still not, is that who I am? Like, I don't know.
Hmm.
But it's like, but this identification is so external focused. And there is this, I think, um, even almost like a war with the against the internal, subtle, I think truer part of who we actually are
Hmm.
that isn't bound by the external, because there's such a preoccupation with the most superficial, the most external aspects of people. And there's kind of a negation of the power of that internal part of ourselves.
Hmm.
So I think like that, which is another problem with forcing this identification. I think there is this kind of loss of connection to this internal stuff. If in my graduate class, if I'm teaching about psychological concept and they're going immediately for the most external, superficial race and gender stuff, they're not going into the internal as much. And yeah, and it gets fit into these rigid scripts of what it's not even just about making the racial identification, but it's a racial identification in this very rigid, scripted, narrow way.
Hmm.
Um, so it's a really unusual psychological pattern, and I don't think we even know, where this is going. I think that this this has been soaked in by a lot of people. And I think that's set a ton of processes in motion
Hmm.
that we don't know where they're going to go. And this is kind of continuing to unfold. But I think it was a momentous event in global history to unleash this on the world. I think it's a big deal. And I think it could have really, really monumental hit consequences for the world.
I think you're right about that. And I'm interested in maybe we could have another conversation off of this at some point, because one of the things I'd love to talk with you about is social media and how we curate an identity for social media. And so I know that's a big branch off of this tree. It's a big tangent, but
It's totally connected, totally connected. And one of the, lots to critique about Lacan, but Lacan is an influential psychoanalyst, and there's a lot I don't like about him, and his thought, but there's some things that I think he does get right. And one of the things that he really centers is an indecipherable essay that may or may not be worth reading called The Mirror Face and the Function of the Eye. Um,
mm-hmm.
and it's not I might not be quoting that exactly correctly, but um basically he talks about how this identification, that self-image really sets up all the dysfunctional processes psychologically that people have. And you make of because you now have to be um coherent.
Mm-hmm.
You like it's weird how there's this pressure to like not do things that are out of character because that would strike others as odd,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're kind of now confined by needing to be in character, and the character that you're having to be is rooted in this self-image that isn't who you are,
Mm-hmm.
because who you actually are is infinite and complex and always changing and not that. But people trap themselves in these identifications, and then um and it can be confining and it can generate symptoms. And I think that's pretty central Lacanian claim.
I'm not familiar with that thinker or that work, so I really
Oh,
would like
okay.
to I'd like to read that. That sounds fascinating. I was having some of the same thoughts just now, and I'm glad you brought that up because it seems to me that identity focus, if we focus on our own identity, to that can be really detrimental in a lot of ways because it's limiting in the ways that you mentioned, and it's also limiting in terms of, I mean, the word narcissism is thrown around so much right now. And so that's a whole topic in and of itself. There's so much discussion of narcissism. And yet, if you think about the original myth, Narcissus falling in love with his own image, and that's a lot of what we are doing in a way when we interact with these profiles and avatars of ourselves out in virtual space, but also a lot of what we're kind of being encouraged to do through these identity models that we're engaging with so much, that ask us about our
Yeah.
race and our demographics. And so we're looking very intently and very obsessively at the most superficial aspects of ourself. And I think there's a lot to say about that, about
So,
how
so yeah, totally. And it's like, and it is a narcissistic dynamic. You know how narcissistic dies, or how narcissist dies,
narcissists.
and that narcissist dies in that story. He wastes away
Mhm.
because his energy is depleted trying to obtain his self-image.
Mhm.
He wastes away. It's there's something, and psychoanalytically, I mean, Freud knew these myths. And
Mhm.
when he talked about narcissism, he was thinking, I think there's a strong argument that he was very much thinking about these myths
Mhm.
and thinking about somebody taking on their own self-image as like an erotic object
Mhm.
and pouring energy into the cultivation of this thing and actually becoming depleted and fragile as a result of it. Um, there's a lot happening here, but this is all kind of like, in a way, in the context of this racial schema, these are all these new things, and we need to really start mapping what's happening to people as they're being, I think, more and more propagandized through education system, through the media, into these, I think, really dysfunctional racial identifications.
Well, I think that brings it full circle, and
Okay.
it's as good a place as any to stop it.
Yeah,
I hope we can go into some of these topics some more.
me too.
All right. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Thanks, Leslie.